okay.
It was right close to the road, and it was moved back off the road probably in the late 70s. Moved maybe 50 feet back off the road, had big oak trees in the front yard.
Hmm.
And it was a two-story log house.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I remember correctly. And it burned and was torn down.
I'm not sure if this is the same one or not. It's an E-front house, 3-bay, in chimney, and it has at the end chimney it has a little saddlebag, and it had one little dormer on the I guess it was the kitchen.
Hmm.
I'll
Well,
have to send it to you.
Yeah, I mean, there's several old houses right here in the Florence, Westminster community, and some of them are known and some of them aren't.
Yeah.
Catherine, are we going to start at 6:05?
I was just about to interrupt you guys. So we can just go ahead and start. Just want to welcome everybody to the Guilford 250 lecture series. Tonight, our topic is Jamestown with the wonderful Shawn Rogers. First, let's go through just some light housekeeping. So thank you for everybody for coming and listening to us. Everyone is muted and your videos are disabled. So we can't see or hear you, but we know that you're here. And thank you for joining us. This is going to be recorded and put on our YouTube page as well as our Facebook page. If you're having any technical issues, please utilize the chat function and I will try my best to help you. Again, this is presented by Preservation Greensboro. We are Guilford County's only non-governmental membership organization focused on architectural history. Our chat function today is primarily to talk amongst yourselves, say hello, how are you? But then we also have the Q&A section, which is primarily to ask questions to the panelists today. So if you can use those functions as described, that would be wonderful. Now I will stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Benjamin.
I'm just going to welcome everybody and show and voice my appreciation for joining us this evening. I hope you're all well, and I'm hoping the wind has calmed down where you are. I'm very happy to introduce Shawn Rogers, who is the Chief of Staff, the Director of Jamestown Historical Society, which is a historical and architectural advocate for primarily the Jamestown and Deep River communities sandwiched in between Greensboro and High Point. And if you all have not visited Mendenhall Homeplace, which is, I'll just tell you, a few years ago, we had a vernacular architecture forum, a North American group of scholars who go all over the country to look at architecture, and they met in Durham. And half of the crowd boarded buses in Durham and came all the way up to Jamestown to visit Mendenhall Homeplace, the Bank Barn, the Mendenhall Counting House across the street. They just were absolutely fascinated with the architectural resources we had in Jamestown. And they looked at other sites as well, but really they had their lunch in the picnic shelter across the street from Mendenhall, just because it's such a wonderful place. So I want you all to be as excited as I am about the architecture and the history of Jamestown and the Deep River communities. Many of you might remember that it was Mark Twain that said something along the lines of history never repeats itself, but it rhymes an awful lot, or sometimes it rhymes. And that's an apt statement for tonight, because we just had a bit of a whirlwind go right up Business 85, passed close to Jamestown, and Shawn will give us a little bit of a story about an echo of that time that happened in Jamestown history when another whirlwind came up from the southwest and crossed through the area. So we're in for a real treat to hear Shawn's presentation and to learn more about the incredible village of Jamestown. So thank you, Shawn, for being part of this.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me. Okay, so I am going to share my screen. Here we go. Okay, thank you so much. And once again, very happy to be here with you virtually. And today we're going to take a virtual tour of Jamestown's early history and architecture. And I'm going to start talking a bit about the fact that early Jamestown in many ways was the cultural, educational, commercial, and industrial center of Guilford County years before High Point existed and Greensboro grew to prominence. It was home to our county's earliest medical school, law school, debating society, temperance society, manumission society, and female academy. By the 1830s, this small town of no more than 150 inhabitants was home to over 36 manufacturing concerns, blacksmith shops, tanneries, saddleries, shoe shops, plow and farm tool shops, grist mills, sawmills, oil mills, even gold mills, gold mines, and of course, rifle shops and rifle mills. Of course, the Jamestown rifle, the Jamestown School of the Long Rifle, the traditional Pennsylvania long rifle, highly prized by gun collectors. Some of the finest pieces of craftsmanship I've ever seen, and also was a source of great prosperity for a number of people here in Jamestown, many of which were Quakers, of course. Okay. Before we begin our virtual tour of the architecture of early Jamestown, let's first discuss how the town came to be. Not surprisingly, Jamestown began with a guy named James, of course, who was a young Quaker who was born in 1715 in East Calm Township, Chester County, Pennsylvania, which is 38 miles west, about 38 miles west of Philadelphia, and what is now known as Downingtown, Pennsylvania. In fact, I actually have an image. This building still stands. This is the birthplace of our James Mendenhall. It was built around 1714 by his father, Aaron Mendenhall. His mother was Rose Pearson, the daughter of Captain Tom Pearson. Basically, William Penn's right-hand man, his surveyor. Nearly every generation of Mendenhalls, going all the way back, at least back to Nereus, Richard's son, were surveyors. Okay, and actually on the site today, which I hope to visit soon, just behind the little home here in Downingtown off of Bondsville Road, is the remains of James Mendenhall's first mill. He wasn't but 18 years old when he constructed it. The home is actually on the property that originally belonged to his grandfather, John Mendenhall, who is the immigrant of Wiltshire, England, who came over around 1683 with William Penn and a few of his siblings. One of them was actually my ancestor, Mary Mendenhall Newland. Okay. So in the 1750s in southeastern Pennsylvania, there were a lot of change going on. Philadelphia was the main port of entry for many immigrants at that time, and there were a lot of people coming in, and they were leasing land and they were buying land. So real estate prices went through the roof. It was a very competitive market, and with the relative increase in population density, there was a need for new infrastructure, roads, bridges, and other such things for these new homesteads and farmsteads. And you know what that means? Taxes, more taxes. And when you have a group of people who aren't taxed very much and all of a sudden have to pay quite a bit in taxes, they're usually not too happy. And not only that, with the changes in demographics, governance was changing, politics was changing. Quakers, for the most part, had dominated the state and local scene as far as governance was concerned, and things were changing. And for a lot of those reasons, people felt compelled to make a change. And many of these people, Quakers in particular, sometimes entire meetings would pick up and travel down the Great Wagon Road through the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. And many of them settled right here in Deep River, North Carolina. And one of those people, of course, was James Mendenhall, who made his way here by at least 1759. By 1762, James had successfully obtained a Granville grant deed from Roger Carteret, the Earl of Granville. Actually, he was the last of the 8 Lord Proprietors in North Carolina. And James secured a grant of 240 acres. Basically, that land now occupies what is now the High Point City Lake and a part of the City Lake Park. Just a few years after arriving, around 1765, James had already constructed a substantial wooden frame house on a slight bluff on the south bank of the west or south fork of Deep River. You have the west or south fork of Deep River, and then you have the north fork. Let's just call them south and north, okay? So this is the south fork. And these structures were actually added later, around 1848, by James Mendenhall's grandson, George Cameron Mendenhall. We'll talk about him a bit later. But for now, back to James. About the same time, James, maybe even perhaps a few years earlier in this, James had built a grist mill and a sawmill that was powered by these tub turbines. It was called a tub mill. So basically the way it worked, you would set up a mill dam and you would have these plumes that came down and basically out of sluices. And this water pressure would be concentrated into the plume and fall over a turbine that's actually encased by this large tub, like a large barrel. And that was the motive power for these mills, for the grindstones, and of course, for the traditional sash saw, which in its many iterations, who knows how many miles of board stock was milled there. And a lot of that historic fabric still remains in some of the older buildings that survive in and around Jamestown. So, believe it or not, by 1775, about 10 years after he builds his home and he has his mills up and going, James decides he's struck by wanderlust again, essentially, looking for greener pastures. He takes his wife, his oldest son, and he joins some neighboring Quakers and also some Quakers from back home in Chester County, Pennsylvania. And they move to an area of northeast Georgia where they establish a new Quaker meeting, the Wrightsboro meeting. And James leaves this well-developed estate with the mills and the home and the outbuildings and the home to his son, George Mendenhall. We'll just call him George Sr. As a matter of clarity. And George is an industrious, entrepreneurial-minded young man, like many early Quakers were. You probably heard the old saying, you know, the Quakers came south to do good and did great. Well, Quakers knew that in order to do well for others, you of course had to do well for yourself, and they did that in spades, and were quite generous with their success, as you'll see here shortly. So James decides to take advantage of the fact that the Salisbury Stagecoach Road basically runs right at the doorstep of his home. So according to family tradition, he starts renting out rooms in his home as an inn. And he does terrific business. It turns out he has the perfect site and situation along the road. It's a great stopping off point for travelers and wayfarers. So he does excellent business, much to the chagrin of a rival innkeeper who lived just, several miles up the road. And it's said by Mary Mendenhall Hobbs, the great-great-granddaughter of George Mendenhall, that according to stories told by her father, Nereus, that this rival innkeeper had influence with the Guilford County commissioners and arranged for a road jury to be called. And not surprisingly, the road jury made the decision to reroute the old Petersburg-Salisbury Road to almost a full mile south, basically leaving George high and dry, which is kind of funny because his home place, is what's left of it, is now under the waters of City Lake Park, because in 1928, the Army Corps of Engineers, along with the city of High Point and the state of North Carolina, had built a dam below the north and south forks of Deep River that created a relatively large drinking water reservoir to supply High Point, and they needed it at the time, of course. So the current water line would be right about here. And for many years, these chimneys, at least a couple of them, actually stood tall out of the surface of the water. And a lot of fishermen like to go back into this little cove here to fish, and they got tired of bumping into the chimneys, so they got permission to knock them down, which was actually, in the long run, helpful to us here at the Historic Jamestown Society and Mendenhall Homeplace, because several years ago, the lift stations or pump stations were manipulated to lower the level of the lake so they could clean out the pumps and debris from the dam. So I had an opportunity to go down and harvest some of the bricks that were actually part of the James Mendenhall chimney stacks here. And later, we secured a federal preservation from pass-through grant. We're able to use those bricks. They were actually utilized to restore the chimney stacks here at the Richard Mendenhall Homeplace. Of course, Richard being the grandson of James. So we're really happy about having that connection. The date stones for these buildings, the one marked GCM, George Cameron Mendenhall, 1848, and another 1765 actually reside here at Mendenhall Homeplace. They were a gift of Martha Robbins Tilden and her daughter Sophie, who actually painstakingly shipped these date stones out before the area was inundated with the waters of what is now High Point City Lake. So back to George. George decides, look, if you're going to move the road away from my place, I'm going to move my place towards the road. So as soon as he finds out where the new Salisbury Stagecoach Road is going to be established, he's set on acquiring land on either side of this new road. And he's surprised to find out, after a little bit of research, that he actually already owned most of that land. You see, his father, James, before leaving for Georgia in 1775, had acquired a large section of property from the heirs of Richard Beeson. And of course, James, about 6 years after moving to Georgia in 1781, passes away. So George unwittingly had inherited this property. And it wasn't long after that he inherited that property that he lays out of town. But before I get to that, I want to talk about this image. I couldn't resist including this. This is actually an image of the old James and Hannah Thomas Mendenhall spring house or pit house. And the reason why I'm showing it, you can actually see part of the old mill. This is not the Mendenhall mill, but it was built on the original foundation of the mill. This, I think, was constructed by a man named Oliver Bimbo. Nonetheless, this spring house was raided by British troops. There was a detachment of about 50 troops that were sent out by Cornwallis to press the James Mendenhall mill into service. They were camped near Deep River Friends meeting just a couple days before the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. And when they arrived, they raided the house. They basically took all the foodstuffs. But the last straw for Judith Gardner Mendenhall, George's wife, was when one of them supposedly took the milk cow, which is all she had left to feed herself and her 6 children. And so as the story goes, she marches up the hill, has a lively conversation with one of the officers, and shortly thereafter walks back down the hill with the milk cow in tow. That's an excellent story, but this is the first time I've had a chance to actually share this image that was acquired not too long ago. Okay, back to this town. So George, once he secures an affidavit, proving that he owns this property, not long thereafter, maybe as early as the mid-1790s, he lays out a town. And he lays it out on a grid with roads perpendicular to each other, just like the great Quaker William Penn had done in Philadelphia. And it subdivides the town basically into little blocks that are themselves subdivided into little half-acre lots. Interestingly, the east-west street, the northern border, was called James Street, or excuse me, George Street, for George Mendenhall, the founder. And the street down below, which I don't think was ever actually established, but was in the plan, Judith Street at the southern border, running east and west. The main street was known as Federal, and the main cross street going north and south. On the plan, it says Scientific, but I think they figured it out later. It's now known as Scientific Street. Most of these lots were actually given, to children of George and Judith Gardner Mendenhall. One of them being Richard Mendenhall, and this is the Richard Mendenhall Homeplace, which is is the primary holding of Historic Jamestown Society. And you'll see here, it's a beautiful example of mid-Atlantic Georgian architecture. You're going to see a few more. It's been said that this is probably the single greatest grouping of mid-Atlantic Georgian architecture in the South, and I don't think anyone really put up much of an argument on that. This is the core block of the house, and has fairly ordered fenestration, 3-bay. You see that the chimneys are actually inset. This architecture was old-fashioned in 1811 when it was built. Usually by this point, you would see the external chimney stack. Notice the segmental arches, the blind segmental arches that are filled. There was a transom added sometime probably in the 1830s to the arch of the front door. Sometime in the late 1820s, early 1830s, a 2-story brick addition was added on to the home. And shortly thereafter, after that, well, actually, let me tell you a bit about this tornado. I think it was April 8th of 1837. One afternoon, a tornado ripped through Jamestown, and it actually tore off the upper section of this 2-story brick addition and threw most of this upper level headlong into Federal Street, into Main Street. Richard and Mary Peg Mendenhall's youngest son, Richard Junius Mendenhall, was actually sleeping in front of the fireplace when it happened. And he later said that he was awakened. He turned up and he looked towards where the ceiling should have been, and it was gone. All he saw were dark clouds wafting overhead. So shortly thereafter, obviously some repairs had to be made, and they rebuilt the upper section mainly of wood. Just the brick gable walls remained. And they also, I believe, enlarged the windows. The original windows were probably significantly smaller than this. See the large 4 or 12 over 12 sash. Shortly after that, this 2-tier tidewater porch was added, which would be rather unusual for this area. I think the Charles Bimbo house is the only one I could think of this vintage that actually had this particular feature in this area of Guilford, or in Guilford County. Sometime in 1849, we know this based on surviving correspondence, this veranda was added on the side and in the back. Sometime in the 18th, after the Civil War, this part of the porch was actually closed in and served as the post office. And Minerva, the lady of the house at the time, actually served as Jamestown's first postmistress. Richard Mendenhall, of course, what an interesting guy. He was a jack of all trades, a true Renaissance man. He was a cabinet maker. He was a tanner. He was likely a potter. He was a carpenter. He was a scientist. He was a classical scholar. His first child, my goodness, was named Minerva, of all things. You know, think about it. Early Quakers didn't even use they give it names for the days of the week and months of the year because they were named for pagan gods and Roman emperors who were worshipped as deities. He's a different kind of guy. Richard also was the founding member of the North Carolina Manumission Society and actually served as its president for a short time. His children went on to do wonderful things. Minerva, the oldest child, she was actually born in a house in 1813, died there in 1900. She was the first matron of North Carolina's first mental health hospital, and also Tennessee's first mental health hospital. Was a matron for a local college, Concord Female College down south, and really was a shadow business manager for a lot of the major businesses in High Point, Greensboro later on. Her sister Judith was, you'll see the building later, was the headmistress for the a freedmen school in Jamestown that was started in 1867. She settled her brother Cyrus's estate. He died in 1884. He was a 3-term mayor of Greensboro who was responsible for, among other things, changing the Greensboro city charter to allow for taxation to support public schools. Cyrus, of course, was a study in contrast. He took a less than Quakerly approach to a number of things. He was disowned for marrying out of unity. Married a non-Quaker named Nancy Staples out of Stewart, Virginia. And he later, during the Civil War, actually teamed up with 2 rifle makers named Ephraim Jones and Grafton Gardner, a distant cousin, and started the Mendenhall Jones and Gardner Rifle Company. And during the Civil War, they actually started at the old Clapping Gate shop on Rock Creek Dairy Road in eastern Guilford. It was soon thereafter moved to where Oakdale Cotton Mill is today in Jamestown. They had a contract to make 10,000 rifles for the Confederate Army. Not too Quakerly, but nonetheless, they didn't come close to filling that order. Judith, as a manager for Cyrus's estate, actually negotiated the lease of a drugstore to a man named Lunsford Richardson, excuse me, and a Mr. Ferris. Of course, Lunsford Richardson developed what we now know as Vicks Vapor Rub. Okay, some interesting features within the Richard Mendenhall house. Splayed reveals. This is true structural brick masonry. So really starting at the cellar level, you have stone masonry almost 2.5 feet thick. Then you have about 18 inches of brick masonry, and it gets thinner as you go up. And because of the relative thickness of the wall, you have a deep jamb. So what was done, they're splayed at an angle outwards, known as a splayed reveal. And that allows the light to reflect off the jambs and then reflect the light onto adjoining surfaces like the walls. And as a matter of fact, you see this this window is actually at the southern elevation, and there's a porch at the back here. But it has a canted sill. The light actually reflects off the canted windowsill and shines onto the ceiling. You can barely see it there. And of course, the most photographed staircase in North Carolina. I don't think there's much doubt about that. Here it is, a box-type corner stair. Really, the only reason it was fashioned this way was to maximize space. It was all about the economy of space. Interesting feature upstairs in the old parlor chamber, you see a little inset warmer into the chimney stack. Of course, it's an inset chimney. There's the firebox, and basically what you would do in the winter, you'd have your fire going in the firebox, and you'd probably take these little pieces of soapstone, which is highly conductive to heat. Heats up quickly, stays warm, it's easy to cut. You can actually cut it with a wood saw with a little bit of water. Cut them into small pieces, you wrap them in cloth, you stick them in the warmer. Pardon me, you go about your business. You come back when you're ready to go to bed at night, and you would pull these stones out and put them at the foot of your bed or in your bed to warm you. Now, you wouldn't need it in this room. We have a fireplace right here, but the adjoining hall chamber does not have a fireplace at all. Hence the necessity of this little feature. Over here, you know, after the tornado, a couple of these doors were added, and, you know, you think about it, 1837, the Greek revival style was quite popular nationally, thanks to a number of house pattern books, some of them authored by the like of Asher Benjamin, Menard Lefevre. You're going to see an excellent example of Greek architecture in just a moment. But look what they've done. This is wonderful. I love this. This is actually a board and batten door, essentially like a barn door, and it has a Greek facing on it. It makes it appear to be an actual two-panel door. You can see where part of the vertical boards actually split, kind of gives up the trick there. Also couldn't resist adding this. This is an image that I discovered not too long ago. It was in a wrong file. It was misfiled at the French Historical Collection in Guilford College. And I was really surprised to find it. It was in a totally unrelated folder. But look, there's the Richard Mendenhall house. That's Federal Street, Main Street. And this is a work crew. They're actually putting down pavers for a walkway in front of the house. But back here in the distance, I noticed something, and I knew to look there. And hopefully you can see it. See the roof? See the overhang? See the wall? This photo was likely taken sometime in the late 1880s. And that is, I believe, Henry Humphrey's high log house or kitchen. Dating back to 1812, that structure was cited as a landmark in land deed descriptions. You know, 1812 and even as late as 1851 for Richard Mendenhall's wife, Mary Peg Mendenhall's dower. Henry Humphreys, of course, it was known to have at that early period sold leather goods, basically had a saddlery there, which makes sense because he wasn't more than, 30 or 40 yards away from Richard Mendenhall's tan shop. He, of course, went on, moved to Greensboro and built the Mount Hecla cotton mills, which was the first steam-powered cotton mill in North Carolina. And Benjamin can tell you more about him. He's well acquainted with one of his residences. Okay, here's the Richard Mendenhall store. Richard Mendenhall was doing quite well in a number of his ventures. They likely had a saddle shop, a harness shop at some point. His tannery was doing well. So by 1824, he was doing well enough to build his own store building. I recently discovered that learned that this store building was built by a man named Ezra Kersey. His brother Elazier actually built the old rock engine gold mill, also known as the McCulloch Castle, in 1832. Wonderful building. Much like the Richard Mendenhall house, it features Flemish bond. Basically, you have a stretcher, which is the side of a lengthwise brick, the face of a lengthwise brick, with the end face of a brick known as a header. And it alternates in rows and courses. So not an easy type of masonry to execute as far as brick masonry is concerned. Most examples, people are absolutely astounded to see this. So many Flemish bond buildings, because in most places they would just have the Flemish bond at the facade, at the prevailing or the elevation facing the prevailing roadway. But in these buildings, all the way around. And look, just like the Richard Mendenhall house, look at these little porthole ventilators. Absolutely beautiful. And these stone cornice returns of sort, which are structural. And that is part of this corbelling at the gable. And hopefully I'll be able to show you a closer detail. It's alternating courses of headers, and headers that are oriented at a 45-degree angle, that basically you see the point of the brick. Some people, it's known as cogging. Some people call it dog toothing or dog tooth. And the stone lintels over some of the doorways and windows. And also, if you look closely, you can see some jack arches here. This house is one of the peculiar things about it. It has an external chimney stack on one side and a triple flue inset chimney on the other side. And it's a modified Quaker plan. I'm not going to get into that moment. Maybe if you come by and visit me, we'll have a chance to take a look at it. No promises, but maybe we can work something out. Now, there were two corner fireplaces on one end of the building, and there was a partition wall in between the two. So you basically have a corner fireplace in each of the two rooms, adjoining rooms. But look, there is another firebox oriented outside externally, which is very interesting. I've only seen a couple examples of this. There's one up in Virginia somewhere in the Shenandoah Valley. I hope to visit soon. There's a dead man's door. There's actually a dead man's door on the back of the Richard Mendenhall house. A dead man's door, well, it's basically gives you an option of hoisting items up or lowering them down from an upper level. The main reason these were utilized because the stairwells were, the staircases were too narrow or too tight for whatever reason. So this gave you a relatively easy way to move goods up and down. It's called a dead man's door. Of course, if you walk out of the dead man's door, you're going to hit the ground. This first step is a killer. Some people have pointed to these little holes in the masonry here at the rear elevation of the building and said, oh, well, maybe there was some type of decking or stairs. I don't think so. It was pointed out not too long ago, actually by Shirley Hayworth. She did some research on this. Those are post holes. And while they were actually stacking the brick for these walls, what they would do is leave some of the headers halfway open. So you could basically hammer in these posts, these beams, pardon me, that you could then put scaffolding on. And so then you would have some here, you would have some there. But what you would do when you were finished, since they're only half headers, they don't go all the way fully into the wall. What you do is you take a half header, butter it with mortar, and stick it in. Well, those generally fail first because they're not full brick. And that's why you see these little voids. Oh, and look, and you can see our cogging, our dog teeth. See them? Okay. This is the old Jamestown Meeting House. It was thought to have been built around 1814 and may actually be quite older than that. It was built by the Mendenhalls. Has two external chimneys, relatively steeply pitched roof. Look, here we go. Cogging at the corbel. Gee whiz, those aren't even segmental arches. They're almost semi-elliptical arches. Beautiful Flemish bond building. Oh, and look at this young lady. That is Clara Wildman, and it turns out she's the granddaughter of Judith Mendenhall, a sister of our Richard, and the daughter, granddaughter of Judith Mendenhall. And let me get back to that. Oh, actually, look at this. And most of you know that this building still stands in High Point City Lake Park. The parking lot is right here. This is where George Street would have been, the northern border of historic Jamestown. And look over to the side, see the fence? That's where the little cemetery is, burial ground is, adjoining the meeting house. But look at this shadow. This shadow is actually being cast by this structure. If you look over here, look, you can see part of the old Jamestown meeting house, which was an indulged meeting house, by the way. It was never prepared a meeting. It never was meant to be a meeting in and of itself, or a monthly meeting on its own. And basically, it was a satellite meeting established by Deep River Friends to give people in the vicinity of in Jamestown an opportunity to worship throughout the month without traveling all the way back to the main meeting house at Deep River, and also during times of inclement weather. I wonder if they would have used it today. Okay, so Judith Mendenhall, this was likely built around 1814 for Judith Mendenhall, who later married Elias Henley and moved to Indiana. She and her brother Richard helped establish one of the first female academies in Guilford County, actually probably the first Guilford female academy in Guilford County, and arguably the first female academy in North Carolina, Salem Academy. They like to make a claim on that, even though they weren't chartered until 1836. There are advertisements that exist, print advertisements that were published in local newspapers, in Greensboro Patriot, I think even in the Raleigh Register, and advertised the fact that these young ladies weren't just learning how to weave hair into watch fobs. They were studying science, geometry, algebra. The James Mendenhall Bank Barn is actually located here at Mendenhall Homeplace. It was built on lots that were owned by James Mendenhall the Younger, Richard Mendenhall's younger brother, and of course the son of George and Judith Gardner Mendenhall. He was a Wagner, and so he likely was responsible for hauling out a lot of the goods for sale or out to market. The original, this is a Pennsylvania style bank barn, probably the oldest of its type, authentic example of its type in the South. Of course, here's the facade, and at the rear, you see this projecting bay. That was known as a post schutz. I know I butchered that. My German's horrible, but it essentially means protection in the back. You see, the projecting bay here actually gives you additional floor space on the second level, but look, it also offers protection for your stock down below. You see a true bank building. Look, it's the lower level is actually cut into the embankment of the hill, so you can access the top and bottom, the top level and the lower level just by using the slope of the hillside. But it also acts as a cellar of sorts. So in the summer, it's relatively cool, and the winter, it's relatively warm. It's an ideal place for your stock. James actually, during the War of 1812, at least actually is reported to have happened twice, but once he took a load of goods to Richmond, and he went inside and he came back and he found a note under a rock. And it basically had said that the U.S. Army had commandeered his team and his wagon for military purposes. It took him 16 years, but eventually he was compensated for his loss with interest. Must have been a pretty persistent guy. He actually, his estate, his actual plantation home, plantation was located where Pennyburn is today, Maryville. It's about a 150-acre estate. It had what was described as a mansion. Would really be interested to see what that looked like. And he actually had a gold mine on the property, just like his brother Richard did, by the way, on the other side of $40 Spring Branch. Okay, really quick. The William Reese House, built circa 1836. It stands towards the western end of Historic Jamestown Society. William Reese was an early constable. Later on, he became an agent for the North Carolina Railway. Actually moved close to where the Ragsdale home is now. Later on, shortly thereafter, a man by the name of J. Harper Johnston lived in the home. He was a sheriff's deputy. He was also an interesting guy. His claim to fame is that he never carried a gun because he didn't need one. There's kind of a funny story. He went to William Welch's store one time in what is now High Point. William Welch, of course, was one of the early proprietors in the city of High Point. He went to get molasses, and it was a particularly cold day. And William Welch opened up his tap, and it was coming out as slow as you might imagine, molasses in the wintertime, right? So he said, well, we'll come back in about 4 or 5 hours and see what we have. Well, came back about 5 or 6 hours later, and pretty much the entire contents of this barrel of molasses was out on this floor. He was so angry that he sold his entire stock of molasses to Harper Johnson right there on the spot. And Harper Johnson took him up on the opportunity. And a few days later, William Welch came back with his hat in his hand to rebuy his portion of his stock of molasses. The Madison Lindsay House, one of my favorite structures here in Jamestown. It was actually located on the southwest corner of Main Street, Federal, of course, and Scientific, which is, was basically the planned center of town. And the upright section likely dates to 1817. The back section of the house may actually be part of an original home that was built by Elijah Charles for his brother John Charles, who was the first postmaster in Jamestown. It's a 4-bay home. See the 4 windows. And if you look carefully, look, there's a window, there's a door. Nothing here. And another window. Well, there actually was a second door here. David Lindsay likely had the upright section built around 1817. He likely built this as a store building. By 1821, his nephew, Isaac James Madison Lindsay, we call him Madison, leased the building, and for the next 10 years or so, operated a medical school and medical shop there. Some of the people who studied there who went on to become physicians are Dr. Shubal Coffin, Dr. Milton Worth, Dr. George D. Mendenhall, who was actually a son of James the Younger, the wagoner, and who else am I forgetting? Oh, yeah, Joseph Addison Weatherly. Shubal Coffin and Milton Worth actually attended a 1-year medical program at Transylvania University in Lexington, Kentucky. And Shubal Coffin later in 1846 was granted an honorary MD. So in 1830, I think it was around 1831, Madison Lindsay is named the postmaster for Greensboro, so he moves there. And the house, a handful of years later, was actually inhabited by another nephew of David Lindsay. His name was William Pinckney Lindsay, and he was a carriage maker. And he lived there until 1857, when his wife, Charity Beeson Lindsay, passed away. She was buried at the old Lindsay Cemetery behind the old Robert Lindsay, on the old Robert Lindsay plantation. Of course, the Lindsays were prominent Scots-Irish Presbyterians in western Guilford County, and Robert's house, of course, was the site of the first court for Guilford County in 1771. Okay, so after that, in 1857, the Reverend Alexander Robbins purchased the home, and he came to Jamestown to become to help establish a new female academy for the Methodist Episcopalian Conference. And it just so happens that George Cameron Mendenhall, we talked about him a bit earlier, the youngest son of George and Judith Gardner Mendenhall, he was lobbying hard for Jamestown Female Academy to be established here in Jamestown. And what he did to seal the deal, he donated the property for the campus and actually 2/3 of the cost for the building. And this, I think it was a 3 or 4 story structure. I would have loved to have known exactly what it looked like. It was dedicated in 1859. It stood just west of Scientific on what is now Robbins Road going towards Flowers Bakery, right at the apex of that hill. And it opened in 1859, and unfortunately one evening in 1861, a young girl had a badly abscessed tooth, toothache, infection, feverish. She wakes up in the middle of the night, lights a candle, puts it on her chest of drawers, throws open the sash, goes back to bed, wakes up a short time later to screams. Fire has engulfed the outer wall of her room. The curtain had actually blown into the candle, and the conflagration began. It was a total loss. Everyone got out fine. The young ladies were moved to Yadkin College in Davidson County for a short time, actually making that a coeducational institution for a time. After a while, the Yadkin College, it pretty much outgrew the campus. And so by the early 1920s, arrangements were made to establish a new campus at High Point. And of course, we know the rest of that story. So George Cameron Mendenhall may actually be considered the father or a father of High Point University. Okay, let's see here. George Cameron, by the way, also played an important role in the history of Guilford College. It started as a New Garden boarding school, and in 1834, he was the state senator, and he was the man solely responsible for acquiring the charter for that school, which later, thanks to the contributions of a number of influential Quakers, became what is now Guilford College. Isaac James Madison Lindsay, or Dr. Madison Lindsay, also was a leader for the trustees for the Greensboro Female Academy, and actually donated land for the campus. It's now known as Greensboro College. Okay, there it is. Oh, this picture does not do it justice, and I'm sorry I didn't get a better shot. It was raining the other day, and I waited until the last minute, but here we have it. This is the Coffin Robbins Tilden House. It's possible that it is the original, that it was originally built, pardon me, by Dr. William Mendenhall, another son of George, our founder, and his wife Judith Gardner. And he was original owner of this lot, just a couple lots over here to the west from the Mendenhall Homeplace. And he eventually moves to Anson County and is actually one of the founders of Wadesboro. In fact, it's believed that he actually laid out the town of Wadesboro. He had a little bit of experience surveying. He held the pole for his brother, Nathan Mendenhall, who lived on the north side of Main Street, opposite this home here on the south side of Main Street. That's where Nathan Mendenhall lived. And Nathan was an early commissioner in Guilford County. And as a surveyor, he was charged with finding the exact geographic center of Guilford County. And he found it in the middle of a marsh, basically a duck pond where Fisher Park is today. So he takes a walk south and finds a nice, flat, high piece of land, purchases it on behalf of the county from a man named Ralph Gorell, and proceeds to lay out the town of Greensboro. And of course, William held the pole for him. Later, William Mendenhall's daughter, Laura, had married Dr. Shubal Kaufman. Sound familiar? And they took up housekeeping in this home. And during that tornado that I mentioned earlier from 1837, This home also experienced extensive damage. A good portion of the upper story, the roof, and even the chimneys, totally obliterated. And it's believed that that was the impetus for this remodel, which totally, I'm sure, transformed the house. This house probably looks similar to what the Madison Lindsay house looks like today, just as an example. But look at this. Once again, look at the influences here, probably from these house pattern books that I mentioned earlier of Benjamin and Lefebvre. Look at these porticos with pediment porticos, the vernacular or American Doric columns even have, look, intasis, look at that, the slight bulge in the middle. And of course, it does have the base. And also these windows, they have Doric entablature, and you can't see it, but the facing boards are even stylized to look like pilasters of sorts. It's a beautiful, beautiful building. And the side portico here. On the other side is a glass conservatory, which is actually attached to the structure with iron straps. Okay. Shubal Coffin, when he left, he actually practiced here originally and started a medical school of his own. Later, around 1855, there are changes in the air. There's a shift of sorts. You know, really the history of Jamestown is really about the routing of roads and rerouting of roads. And here's an excellent example of that. When the railroad came in, well, actually, before the railroad came in, a lot of the Coffins and Mendenhalls and many other landowners in town actually advocated for the railroad to come right through the middle of town. Nereus Mendenhall had actually surveyed a track, a proposed track for the railroad that went, came east down Main Street and then turned at an angle right behind the Richard Mendenhall store and cut across to a bridge across North Fork, close to where Cedarwood neighborhood is today, where the old rifle mill was. That didn't win out. The railroad actually was routed to the northeast of Old Jamestown. And Shubal Coffin realized that Old Jamestown would soon be dry bones, or it was old news. He wanted to move where the action was, where the commerce was, where the transportation hub is. And when the depot was established, shortly thereafter, he knew exactly where the depot was going to be constructed. He builds this home around 1855, and it's actually at an angle, and it's said that it was positioned at an angle or built at an angle so he could actually see the trains come and go from the depot. The house itself, it's it looks to be an eye house, really, that has a salt box on the back. See how it comes down at an angle here? It's basically a salt box house, but you can tell, once again, it's heavily influenced by those popular house pattern books of the time, namely those made through the collaboration of Andrew Jackson Downing and Alexander Jackson Davis. And a couple of their books, Downing actually supports the idea of the use of this board and batten siding because, first of all, it's durable, it's practical. Also, it has an honest expression for the structure of the building. It kind of emulates or symbolizes the vertical posts that give the strength, that carry the load of the building itself, the framework of the building. What else do we have here? Oh, these windows are extraordinary, especially those at the front. They go almost all the way to the floor. And actually, the house itself, I guess you could make the case that it has a French air to it, a Cajun air to it. Look at the high rise here on the foundation and these large windows that go all the way to the ground. It's a remarkable structure. Quite a few young men who wore gray were embalmed in this house by Dr. Shubal Coffin and his associates. a lot of makeshift surgeries. A number of troops, like for example, from the Battle of Bentonville, were carried off the train and directly to this place. And at one point, it was told that there were limbs flying everywhere out of the buildings for some of these amputations that had to be made on the fly, and in such great amounts. There actually appears to be 2 surgical rooms in the cellar of the house. It has a herringbone brick floor, and there's even a spring that's accessible from the cellar. Okay. Oh, one quick story. In April, of course, Jeff Davis, the president of the Confederacy, and his cabinet were at Greensboro. And before leaving Greensboro, the day before, Trenholm, the Secretary of Treasury, was sent out to Shubal Coffin Place for treatment. And the following day, the rest of the cabinet rendezvoused here, lunched, got back on their horses, and went down the new Salisbury Road, headed south, ultimately towards Mississippi. Trenholm, it's kind of interesting, I learned this not too long ago. Margaret Mitchell, the author of Gone with the Wind, actually patterned the Rhett Butler character after Mr. Trenholm. Okay, real quickly, I don't know how much time I have left here. This is the Robbins Holton Mill and House. It's on Dillon Road, just outside the confines of historic Jamestown, or Old Jimtown, as it was known. By the way, when the depot was established, that part of town, was often called New Jamestown, Depot Town, or Jamestown Station. Old Jamestown over here, which we now refer to as Historic Jamestown. That's why our society is known as Historic Jamestown Society. Was often called just Old Jimtown. Here it is. It's here's the mill building. It's thought to date to the 1850s. This section, which is believed to be a later addition, could be an older section. And I could not bear to put a modern, a contemporary photo of the mill because it's about to fall into the river, or excuse me, into the creek. It could date back to the 1820s. Jesse Field owned this land back in the 1820s and was known to have had a mill here. Martha Robbins, or excuse me, Mary Robbins, the widow of Alexander Robbins, who I had mentioned earlier, ran this mill for a short time. J. Franklin Mendenhall ended up with it for a short period as well before moving to Jamestown proper. Okay, and finally, the Iddings House. People often wonder about this old place. It's located in front of what is now GTCC, and it was on part of the old Salisbury or Petersburg-Salisbury Road. It's thought to have been built sometime between 1824 and 1826 near the site of a previous building that was constructed by Joseph Iddings. Mark Iddings, his son, was thought to have constructed this place. You have a little kitchen wing off to the side, right off the chimney. Interesting little windows. I wonder if these did not have thicker muttons at one point. Happily, thankfully, this building is or will soon be undergoing a restoration. Just last month, it was announced that major renovation is going to be underway, and that it's actually going to be used again, which is wonderful as far as its possibility for long-term sustainability and preservation. And I've never been in the house, so I haven't been able to obtain an actual image of these doors, but I've heard so much about them. Look at these little diamond-shaped battens. They're or lozenges. This is actually from a book that was written by Frances Johnston and one of her contemporaries, Thomas Waterman. They, during the Depression, They were part of this make work organization for out of work architects and writers, and called the the Historic American Building Survey. Thank goodness for it. There's a lot of interesting information to be gleaned from it. Nonetheless, they put together a book on early architecture of North Carolina, and the Eddings House is featured, and that's where I grabbed this particular image. So with that, I am finished. Does anyone have any questions?
I don't see any questions in the chat that haven't been answered, and there are no questions in the Q&A section.
Oh, that's disappointing.
No, you're very thorough.
I was just going to say,
No, in a
you
great
did your
way.
job correctly.
You get the detail of the sociology of Jamestown, and you get a real insight into the sophistication of the community. People sometimes think that this was backwoods and remote, and it was quite sophisticated. Why don't you speak about that a little bit?
You know what, Benjamin, it reminds me of an incident. I think we were, during the vernacular architecture forum, the excursion, we were in the cellar. Do you recall that interchange?
Yeah.
There were many people who were in the cellar of the Richard Mendenhall house, the core block of the house, the old winter kitchen, and they're looking up at the joists and this and part of the old summer beam that was on the load wall in between. And they were looking at it, and they were looking, in particular, they were looking at the subfloor. And he said, someone had to have added this to make it look old. There's no way that this could have been milled locally, And I'm like, oh, really? James Mendenhall had a tub mill, a sash mill, that was built here as early as 1765. It's amazing.
Yeah.
We do have one question. Do you know where would be a good place to find Jamestown photos from the 20s and 30s?
The 20s and 30s. Oh, wow, that's a good question. If you find any, let me know. There are some scattered about, and some have been, I think, included in some of the publications authored by Mary Browning, but they're few and far between, to be honest, as far as I know.
The society has a few photos. The Friends Historical Collection at Guilford College has some photos. So they're sort of scattered all over. There's not a central collection. Maybe one day we can find an intern to scan all those to put them in one place.
We also have someone wondering about tours available for some of the homes that were talked about tonight.
That's something that we really need to visit soon, especially post-pandemic. Having some kind of a tour, a bus tour of some sorts, a site tour, point tour. But some of the buildings we could arrange for, like the park buildings. I'm really happy to tell you that I'm currently working with the city of High Point, and we're looking to establish or to acquire a long-term lease to the buildings in the park, the Richard Mendenhall store, and also the old meeting house and cemetery. And also the North Carolina Department of Transportation, thanks to the hard work of some of our past board members, namely Tommy Walls, they're looking to establish or to put up a protected crosswalk between the park and Mendenhall Homeplace. So I guess what I'm saying is it is possible that we could probably do a quick tour of the buildings. Maybe we need to arrange for that, and we'll talk with High Point Museum about maybe opening up the old buildings soon so we can let people peek in. As far as the other buildings are concerned, some of them are privately owned and are actually people living in them. So that's a little tricky.
Okay. And we have one more question. The Mendenhall seem to have had capital to build the stores, mills, and tanneries, et cetera, et cetera. Where do their resources come from so they could build so much?
That's a good question. My understanding is that the Mendenhall family, even going back to Wiltshire, England, were well landed and were of course, back then, so much of your wealth was tied to property. They were known to have been millwrights, mechanics, millers, surveyors, like I mentioned before, especially after the first generation or so after they were here in America. So they were skilled people. Like I said before, they were industrious. They were involved in a lot of things.
I always tell people Greensboro and Jamestown falls into this maybe and more so as the southernmost suburb of Philadelphia. And people forget that these first settlers were educated. They had wealth. There were others that came down, but these were not down and out people. Not all of them were not people that were really seeking their fortune here, but they were transplanting the culture of southeastern Pennsylvania into the Piedmont of North Carolina. So we really had an advantage here that you don't see in places like Anson County and Yadkin County and other places. This was a place where wealth was concentrated.
That's an excellent point, Benjamin. I mean, even with the rifles, even with furniture and of course, obviously the architecture. Look at the Mid-Atlantic architecture we have here, just where I'm sitting right now. It's amazing.
It is. Well, thank you so much for taking some time on a stormy night. It's calmed down outside. The sun was poking out a few minutes ago, so we're glad that it's calm and quiet. I so much appreciate your time and expertise and your energy for Jamestown. It's really awesome to see all of this history, and there's so much more. We'll have to do this again and the rest of the history or something in the future.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it, Benjamin. Catherine.
Thanks to everybody who attended tonight. I hope that you'll join us next month in April. Rebecca Barefoot, who's on staff at the National Park Service at Guilford Battleground, will give us some insights on the Guilford Battleground, what life was like at the time of the battle, what actually happened on that very important day, and then looking at the landscape of the battleground as a commemorative landscape, meaning monuments were placed to commemorate people and actions and places. And so there are different layers to look at Guilford Battleground. So that will be what we look at in April. And then in May, we have Valerie Ann Johnson, who used to teach at Bennett College, is now at Shaw University in Raleigh. And she's going to talk about some of the points of pride of Greensboro and Guilford County civil rights era history. And we're lining up additional discussions. Guilford, 250 years old this year, and you all as citizens have so much to be proud of. I hope that you are proud of it. So thanks again, Shawn. And Catherine, I guess you can close out this chat.
Okay. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Bye, everyone.
We appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.